Zimbabwe didn't collapse because of drought. It didn't collapse because of war. It didn't collapse because of foreign invasion. It collapsed because of a decision. And Venezuela, a country sitting on the largest proven oil reserves in the world, didn't collapse because the oil ran out. It collapsed because of the same decision. Two countries, two continents, two governments with entirely different ideologies, the same pattern, the same outcome, and the same ending, the one neither government ever announced, the one the documented record shows anyway. You are not wrong to find this unbelievable. We'll get to what Venezuela's own production data shows, the figure PDVSA did not want published. We'll get to what Zimbabwe's $100 trillion banknote actually tells you, not about inflation, but about what a government destroys when it believes it's only taking land. But the part of this story that almost nobody talks about isn't the collapse. It's what both governments ended up having to do when the collapse was complete. Let's start with what these two countries actually were before the decision. In 1950, Venezuela had the fourth highest GDP per capita in the world, not in Latin America, in the world. By the 1970s, it was the wealthiest country in its entire hemisphere south of the United States. Caracas was called the Paris of South America. The country was a founding member of OPEC. It didn't just produce oil, it helped set the global price of oil. PDVSA was running 3.2 to 3.5 million barrels a day through some of the most sophisticated petroleum operations in the Western Hemisphere, and those revenues funded one of Latin America's most extensive social safety nets, subsidized food, free universities, public health care. Oil paid for all of it. Zimbabwe, at the same time, was the breadbasket of Africa. Not metaphor, documented agricultural reality. Zimbabwe was exporting surplus wheat, maize, and tobacco, feeding its neighbors. In 2000, its commercial farming sector produced 237 million kilograms of tobacco in a single year, as farms were, per hectare, among the most productive in all of sub-Saharan Africa. Beneath both prosperity stories, there was something real and genuinely unjust. In Venezuela, oil revenues flowed upward. By the 1990s, the gap between Caracas's wealthy districts and the rural poor was stark and growing. In Zimbabwe, roughly 4,500 white farmers controlled approximately 70% of the best agricultural land in a majority black country, a direct inheritance of the colonial era, while 70% of the black population lived in subsistence conditions. The grievance was real. The anger was legitimate. Understanding why both governments made the decision they made is the only way to understand why it was so catastrophic. And it is the thing that happened after the decision, what both countries discovered they had actually destroyed, that changes how you understand everything we just covered. But to understand the pattern, you have to understand what both governments were actually taking, and what they did not know they were taking with it. Chavez came to power in 1999 on a documented mandate. Venezuelan oil was not reaching the Venezuelan poor. The argument that the state should control its own resources is not an unreasonable argument. Versions of it have been made by economists across the ideological spectrum. In Zimbabwe, fast-track land reform addressed a colonial wound that had never healed in 20 years of independence. Mugabe was not fabricating a grievance. He was acting on one with a documented historical foundation the international community had largely acknowledged and then failed to address. Both governments were responding to something real. What they did not understand was what they were about to destroy. In 2002 and 2003, following a general strike, Chavez fired approximately 18,000 PDVSA employees, the engineers, geologists, and petroleum scientists who had spent careers learning how to extract oil from specific geological formations under Venezuelan soil. They were replaced with political loyalists. Venezuelan oil production, which had stood at 3.5 million barrels per day, collapsed to approximately 700,000 barrels per day by 2019. That is not a typo. A country holding the largest proven oil reserves on Earth was producing less petroleum than nations with a fraction of its geological endowment, because the people who knew how to extract it were gone. In Zimbabwe, by November 2008, annual inflation had reached 89.7 sextillion%. That is not a typo. The Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe issued a $100 trillion banknote, the largest denomination currency in recorded history. It was not enough to buy a bus ticket. The economy had contracted by roughly 50% in 8 years. But here's the detail that often gets lost in the telling. The people who suffered most were not the wealthy classes the reforms had targeted. In Venezuela, by 2017, the average low-income Venezuelan, the communities the revolution claimed to champion, had lost approximately 11 kilograms of body weight. Journalists called it the Maduro diet. In Zimbabwe, the rural black farmers who received redistributed land found they could not farm it productively. Without commercial credit, without irrigation infrastructure, without knowledge of specific soil chemistry and drainage patterns accumulated across decades on specific parcels, many holdings went underproductive. The communities the reform was designed to lift were requiring international food aid to survive by 2005. Both governments had seized physical assets, but the physical assets were not the productive capacity. What both governments seized was land and oil. What they destroyed was something that had never appeared in any property deed or corporate charter, the accumulated knowledge of how to actually run it. And what both governments quietly did in the years after the collapse, without press releases, without announcements, is the part of the story that tells you everything. Which is why, when you look at what Venezuela and Zimbabwe actually did next, the documented record, not the official statements, you find the same ending to both stories. By 2016, Venezuela was contracting Chinese and Russian state oil firms to operate fields its own engineers had previously managed. The country that nationalized its oil industry to achieve resource sovereignty was now dependent on foreign corporations to extract the oil at all. By 2020, Venezuela was importing refined petroleum products from Iran, a country sitting on the world's largest oil reserves, importing fuel, not because the oil was gone, but because the people who knew how to turn it into fuel were gone. The engineers fired in 2002 had taken positions with oil companies in Colombia, Trinidad, and the United States. PDVSA was holding quiet meetings with the international oil industry, the exact industry the nationalization had been designed to exclude, asking for technical assistance running facilities that Venezuelans had built and once operated themselves. In Zimbabwe, the post-Mugabe government that took power in 2018 began officially courting former white farmers with compensation arrangements and land leases. Documented meetings were held between the new agricultural ministry and representatives of the farming community the fast-track program had expelled. In recorded cases, new black farmers on redistributed land were petitioning for former white farmers to return as consultants to teach them how to work the specific parcels seized from those farmers 18 years earlier. Both governments ended up going back, quietly, to the very people and institutions they had expelled, because the assets, without the knowledge that ran them, were not assets. They were liabilities. You can seize an oil field. You cannot seize the knowledge of how to run one. That is the pattern that destroyed Venezuela and Zimbabwe. Not ideology, not commodity. The destruction of institutional capital. The accumulated expertise that takes decades to build and that can be eliminated by executive decree in an afternoon. Neither country lost its oil or its farmland. What they lost was the people who knew how to use it. And no government decree has ever replaced that. You cannot redistribute knowledge. You cannot nationalize expertise. Both governments made the same mistake for the same reason. They understood that physical assets could be seized, and they did not understand that productive capacity embedded in human knowledge cannot be seized. The lesson is not that reform is impossible. The lesson is that when you destroy institutional knowledge, you do not get to simply decree it back into existence.